Hello, hello, I'm Malik.
I'm Jamie.
And this is World Gone Wrong, where we discuss the unprecedented times we're living through.
Can your manager still schedule you for night shifts after that werewolf bit you?
My ex-boyfriend was replaced by an alien body snatcher, but I think I like him better now.
Who is this dude showing up in everyone's old pictures?
My friend says the sewer alligators are reading maps now.
When did the kudzu start making that humming sound?
We are just your normal millennial roommates processing our feelings about a chaotic world in front of some microphones.
World Gone Wrong, a new fiction podcast from Audacious Machine Creative, creators of Unwell, a Midwestern Gothic mystery. Learn more at audaciousmachinecreative.com.
Find World Gone Wrong in all the regular places you find podcasts.
I love you so much. I mean, you could, up the energy a little bit.
You could up the energy.
I actually don't take notes.
That was good.
I'm just kidding. You sounded great.
So did you.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
There's something special about a late-night campfire that makes storytelling so much better. A lot of it, I think, comes from the sense of intimacy. The sun goes down and the outside world fades away until all that's left is a small circle of warmth and light, with nothing to focus on but the flickering of the flames, the crackling of the wood, the light and the shadow, and the voice of the storyteller, who, if talented enough, can keep you enthralled until the blazing fire is little more than a bed of red embers. There are many different kinds of campfires. There's the beach bonfire, often reserved for large group gatherings, long weekends, and celebrations, suitable for stories of bigger-than-life adventures and triumphs over adversity. There's the winter blaze, stacked and stoked to burn high and hot. It's perfect for tales of creation, magic, history, and mystery. And then there are the fires of late summer, when the days are still long and full of fun, but the nights are getting colder and darker, and the winds of autumn are just over the horizon. It's a time of transition, and these summer campfires seem especially suited to children who themselves are making their own slow transitions from childhood to adolescence, and soon from the secret society of the summer camp back to the rigid ranks of the classroom. These late summer campfires, then, seem expertly crafted for a well-told ghost story or urban legend. Peppered with a few gruesome details and a few bone-chilling scares, they're the perfect way to shake things up and wind things down after a long day spent in the sun. And when they're told especially well, they're sure to keep the listener's mind wrapped with attention, long after the story is over, and long after the fire has gone out. You're listening to Fireside Canada, my podcast about Canadian legends, lies, and lore. I'm David Williams. It's estimated that over 1.5 million kids attend summer camps in Canada each year. And if they're lucky, toward the end of their stay, they'll be treated to a few spine-tingling stories that will keep them jumping at shadows and wondering about what's true and what's not. Tonight, I'd like to share one of those stories. It's a campfire favorite from the lakeshores and backwoods of Ontario, and while on the surface it might seem like any other summer camp legend, this story is a little bit special, and it can help us understand a little more about the creation of urban legends and the nature of summertime scares. So grab a snack and get cozy as I tell you about the legend of Anson Minor. One quick note, this episode is about ghost stories and urban legends, and true to its subject, it contains some descriptions of violence, dismemberment, and murder, and briefly touches on the topic of suicide. Listener discretion is advised. Part 1. legend has it. A few years ago, I was talking with my niece, a middle schooler at the time, when the conversation steered, as it often does, toward the topic of scary stories. She and I share a fondness for the mysterious, the paranormal, and altogether spooky subject matter, and after a brief discussion about the latest horror films, I asked her if she had ever heard any scary stories at school. She nodded and proceeded to tell me about a young girl, roughly the same age, who had recently spent her first night home alone, with only her dog for company. The girl, a friend of a friend, according to my niece, felt perfectly safe sitting on her couch watching Netflix and scrolling social media, until she learned through one alarming post that a crazed killer had escaped a local prison and may have been spotted in her neighborhood. Terrified, the girl rushed through the house, ensuring every single door was locked, but forgetting about the basement window. She went to her bedroom and tried to sleep, taking comfort in the fact that her dog was nearby, curled up just below her bed. Whenever she felt frightened or overwhelmed, she only had to let her hand fall toward the floor, and the dog would give it a reassuring lick. In this way, she was eventually able to fall asleep. A few hours later, she woke to a strange dripping sound coming from the bathroom down the hall, but she was too scared to get out of bed. Telling herself it was just the leaky faucet, she dropped her hand past her mattress and once again felt that warm, reassuring lick along her fingers. The next morning, the strange dripping sound had stopped, and feeling braver in the morning sun, the girl got out of bed, walked to the bathroom, and screamed. Her dog was dead. Mutilated and hanging from the shower head, the dripping sound she had heard the night before was the sound of its blood dripping onto the bathroom tiles. On the shower wall, written in the dog's blood, were the words, "Humans can lick too." Now, my niece told this story with intensity, and with an earnest conviction that it was true. Maybe it didn't really happen to a friend of a friend, but it certainly happened to someone local, and rather recently, as evidenced by all of the modern details. What she didn't know was that the story she had just recounted with breathless enthusiasm is a popular urban legend with a long history. This particular story, most commonly known as the Licked Hand, could be found in print as early as 1976, but even before that, the story was related to a folklorist by a rather detached 21-year-old college student all the way back in 1967, a full half-century before my niece heard the tale, refreshed for a new generation. Urban legends are the evergreens of our folklore forest. Fables, fairy tales, and myths can seem delightfully old-fashioned with their wolves and woodcutters, damsels and dragons, giants and giant killers. Urban legends, on the other hand, are constantly in season, constantly relevant, firmly planted in the present with modern-day characters. These stories aren't about a little girl in a red hood being tricked by a hungry wolf with an odd resemblance to her grandmother. They're about a deep-fried rat being served at the neighborhood fast food joint, or a local high schooler in a car being chased by a killer with a hook for a hand. Their lessons might be similar, but as folklorist Jan Horold Brunvand writes in his book The Vanishing Hitchhiker, quote, "The attitudes are much more graphically and memorably conveyed among the folk by these strange, believable, false-true tales." End quote. And that's really the key to these stories, isn't it? Believability. Have you ever heard about a certain gang initiation involving headlights? The idea is that new gang members were told to drive around at night with their headlights switched off. When another unsuspecting driver came along and flashed their own headlights in response, they would suddenly become a target, and it was the initiate's task to hunt them down and kill them. You might be surprised to learn that that story is nothing more than an urban legend that enjoyed a brief moment of intense popularity in the 1990s. In fact, it was so popular and so believable that it fooled none other than Canada's own Minister of Defence, whose office issued a warning about the fictional danger in November of 1998. We know there are important life lessons to be gleaned from the stories of talking coyotes, foxes, and scorpions who lived once upon a time. But they hit so much harder when we think they happened to real people on a real street in our hometown or province. My wife still recalls the first time she heard about a ghostly hitchhiker who vanished from her seat after being picked up by a well-meaning motorist. The story, which can be traced back as far as the late 19th century, was shared by one of her favorite counselors around the fire at a British Columbia summer camp in the 1990s. He told it with such style, seriousness, and detail that they all went to bed that night believing he had truly lived through that ghostly encounter on a street not too far beyond their campsite. Such is the power of these stories. Shared by our peers or trusted elders, they teach the importance of self-reliance, of vigilance, of trusting your instincts, being wary of others, and of listening to the warnings of those who came before. With their gruesome details and regular inclusion of the paranormal, urban legends are often shared in the schoolyard, at sleepovers, and, of course, by the campfire, as milestones of adolescence and one's coming of age. Perhaps the most chilling are the tales that blend cold-blooded murder with elements of the paranormal and local details to generate a hometown answer to movie monsters like Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, and Freddy Krueger. In New England in the 1980s, that character was known as Cropsy. In Gimli, Manitoba, throughout the 1970s, he was known as Old Man Gimli. And in some places in Ontario, there is one name in particular that, to this day, will strike fear into the hearts of countless summer camp kids, both young and old. That name is Anson Minor. Part 2. The Legend. First, let's set the stage, as that's nearly as important as the story itself. Imagine it's nighttime at a summer camp, deep in the woodlands of Ontario, nestled on the quiet shore of a sparkling lake. The sky is dark, the water is still, and the campfire is smoldering. A single tendril of smoke twists upward into a star-filled sky. You and a dozen other campers are sitting hunched in a semicircle around the flames, blankets over your shoulders, placed in defense of the sharp breeze that occasionally blows in across the water and makes the firelight flicker. A camp counselor, a man who, just a moment ago, led your group through a traditional campfire song, is sitting pensively in the orange light. His downcast eyes seem fixed on the decimated remains of a bag of marshmallows lying at his feet. After a few moments of silence, he rises from his log, walks to the fireside, and places the last piece of firewood directly into the flames. The wood snaps and the fire roars happily at the new sacrifice, shifting its light from a deep orange to a bright and lively gold. The counselor smiles to himself and returns to his place in the circle. He looks at each one of your faces, and then, when he's certain he has your full attention, he begins to speak. It's time you learned the history of this place. You've been camping here for weeks now without knowing what happened. You deserve to know about the land and the camp and the dangers that lurk here, somewhere out in all that dark. It's time you learned the truth. A long time ago, long before the first camper arrived, this land was home to a prosperous and productive farmland, over 160 acres that stretched all the way from the highway to the lake. The farm belonged to a man named Anson Minor, who, together with his beautiful wife and daughter, lovingly tilled the soil and cared for the orchard, those gnarly trees that grow in the shadow of the old barn. I've never seen them bear fruit, but back then they did. It was hard work, but the miners made a good, honest living, and they were happy. Until one tragic summer day, when everything changed. That day, Anson Minor was out threshing his fields when the old tractor he was driving sputtered and coughed and came to a sudden stop. Frustrated, the old farmer leapt to the ground. He was crouched down along its side, leaning in close to get a better look at the engine, when it suddenly roared back to life and lurched forward, knocking him over. He tried to get up, tried to get away from the deadly machinery that was now hurtling toward him, but it was too late. His left foot was caught in the thresher, and he screamed in terror and then in pain as the machine's vicious metal teeth chewed first through his boot and then his foot, tearing the flesh and crushing the bones until little remained. Using all his strength, Anson managed to free himself from the thresher and crawl back to his farmhouse, leaving a trail of blood behind him. There were no doctors in the area, and despite his best efforts to clean and wrap the wound, it became infected, and what little was left of Anson's foot was soon taken by gangrene. He nearly lost his life in those early weeks, but somehow he survived, though forever changed. Having lost his foot to the thresher, Anson was forced to limp to get around, dragging his ragged stump behind him in a struggling gait. Step, scrape, step, scrape, step, scrape. His hindered movement and constant pain made it impossible to work, and his scars weren't just physical. Some say it was the stress that got to him, others that the gangrene had crept to his brain. Whatever the case, Anson Minor slowly lost his grip on reality. He began to see things that weren't there. He would scream at them, sometimes run away from them, but he would never talk about what he saw. He became obsessed with the color green. He boarded up the windows of his bedroom and coated every surface in thick layers of green paint. He hoarded every green scrap of fabric and every green shard of glass he could find, and used them to craft a crude green globe for his lantern. He spent his days locked inside his green room and his nights wandering the farm, the light of his lantern emitting a brilliant green light thanks to the custom globe and the copper shavings and dusting of borax that he fed to the flame. Night after night he would limp through the fields, washing the land in his eerie green light. Step, scrape, step, scrape, step, scrape. Neglected and forgotten, it wasn't long before the farm went fallow, and as the land grew wild and uncontrolled, so too did Anson's mind. Day after day, he slipped deeper and deeper into madness until his family, broke and broken, had no choice but to sell the farm without his knowledge. They spoke to neighbors and placed an ad in several papers, but received no response, except from one interested party who wanted to transform the farm into a summer camp. The family agreed to their rather generous offer, and the miners were given until the end of the month to leave. At first, Anson didn't show any outward response to the news, but inside he was seething, both at his family and the future campers who would dare to invade his home. On the morning of August 1st, the day that the miners were due to leave the farm forever, Anson murdered his family and piled their bodies inside his green room. Then he waited, and when the last rays of daylight receded through the cracks of his boarded-up window, he grabbed his lantern and limped to the barn. He set the lantern down, took a long strand of rope from a hook on the wall, and tied it into a noose. Then he climbed a ladder, slipped the noose through the rafters, tied it off, tightened the loop around his neck, and took his own life as well. That should have been the end for Anson Minor, but some say it was only the beginning. Some say that when his body was discovered, Hanging there in his lantern's sickly green light, the constable cut him down to check for signs of life, then returned to his car to call in the coroner. When he came back to the barn, Anson's body and the lantern had disappeared. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I do know this. Throughout the years, a lot of campers and even some staff have sworn that they've seen a wispy shadow or a fleeting figure looming by the orchard near the old farmhouse, watching them. Others say that they've seen a strange green light bobbing in the distant dark at the edge of the forest. But the most common experience is, I think, also the most frightening. Year after year, dozens of campers have reported waking late into the night, listening to the sound of someone or something limping through the dark. Step, scrape. Step, scrape. Step, scrape. Some have even caught sight of the shadow of a man falling across the bed, cast by the flickering green light of a lantern. Of course, not everyone believes the stories. A few years ago, a certain camp counselor laughed at the legend and mocked the believers. He eased up a bit when he learned that another counselor he was interested in was also a believer, but it didn't last long. Wanting to impress her, he boasted that he would spend the night of August 1st, the anniversary of Anson's death, in the orchard and bravely face whatever phantoms might limp by. He was found the next morning, curled up inside his sleeping bag, his eyes wide with terror, his hair completely white. Both the police and later the doctors at the hospital tried to persuade him to talk about what happened, but he never spoke of the incident. In fact, he never spoke again. The once lively kid became a shadow of his former self and will live the rest of his days inside an Ontario asylum. As for Anson, well, some say he's still out there, shining his lantern in windows and carrying off misbehaving kids in the middle of the night. So his story continues to be shared, if only for the safety of the campers who never realize the danger that might be lurking in the orchard, the farmhouse, the forest, or just behind the cabin wall. We have a few rules here at the camp, and for your own safety, you need to follow them. Never wear green on August 1st, and make sure you go inside early, before the sun is set. If you see a green light out in the field or outside your window, don't approach it. Don't even look at it. Look away and wait for it to move on. If you see a strange man standing in the orchard or limping through the trees, don't go near him. Turn around and walk away. And most importantly, if you're lying in your bed late at night and you hear the sound of a step scrape, step scrape, step scrape, outside, by the door, or God forbid, by your bedside, keep your eyes shut. Listen carefully to the footsteps and wait until he passes. It's Anson Minor, searching for his next victim, and if you see him and his eyes meet yours, you could be next.
Hello, hello, I'm Malik.
I'm Jamie.
And this is World Gone Wrong, where we discuss the unprecedented times we're living through.
Can your manager still schedule you for night shifts after that werewolf bit you?
My ex-boyfriend was replaced by an alien body snatcher, but I think I like him better now.
Who is this dude showing up in everyone's old pictures?
My friend says the sewer alligators are reading maps now.
When did the kudzu start making that humming sound?
We are just your normal millennial roommates processing our feelings about a chaotic world in front of some microphones.
World Gone Wrong, a new fiction podcast from Audacious Machine Creative, creators of Unwell, a Midwestern Gothic mystery. Learn more at audaciousmachinecreative.com.
Find World Gone Wrong in all the regular places you find podcasts.
I love you so much. I mean, you could up the energy a little bit.
You could up the energy.
I actually don't take notes.
That was good.
I'm just kidding. You sounded great.
So did you.
Part 3. The Lore. Now, I bet most of you listening aren't familiar with this story. I certainly wasn't. In fact, I had never even heard the name Anson Minor, let alone his supposed story, until after I began this podcast. I learned about it from Joe Fish, a talented sound designer at the Frequency Podcast Network, who thought it would be a good fit for Fireside Canada. And he was right. Joe first heard the tale of Anson Minor as a child at a summer camp in Nova Scotia. Though that was over 20 years ago, he still recalls specific details that were shared with him across the campfire about Anson's horrific accident, his gangrenous leg, and the signature sound he made when he walked. Step scrape, step scrape, step scrape. It has all the trappings of a classic summer camp ghost story, and at first, I assumed that's all it was. Just another rendition of a by-the-numbers urban legend that you can find almost anywhere. There was one key difference, however. That name. Usually, the villains in these stories are nameless, like the hook-handed killer or the crazed handlicker who hides under the bed. But that name, Anson Minor, is different. It makes it memorable. It feels more unique. As I looked into it further, I learned that this small summer camp legend has had a big impact. It turns out that the ghost of Anson Minor has been step-scraping his way across the country and through the minds of countless Canadian campers for the last 60 years. If you do recognize the name and the story, it's probably because you attended a summer camp, namely a Jewish summer camp, somewhere in Canada over the last few decades. Anson's ghostly green light has been spotted on the shores of Lake Erie, and his telltale shuffling has been heard outside cabins and tents from the wilderness of Muskoka to the backwoods of central Ontario, and even in the wilds of southern Nova Scotia. Now that revelation might come as a bit of a shock to some. True to the nature of urban legends, the story is often told as if it's unique to that specific camp or region. On August 1st, 2022, user @LonnieRosen tweeted, quote, "If you went to a Jewish summer camp in the 70s or 80s, and hopefully beyond then, you probably remember the tale of Anson Minor and won't wear green on August 1st. Turns out the legend wasn't unique to your camp," end quote. Before that, on August 2nd, 2019, @Bronya Meyer tweeted, quote, "Just found out Anson Minor exists at all Jewish summer camps. I feel so betrayed," end quote. Another user, @TalkerDidi, replied, quote, "How if he lived in Lunenburg," end quote. A year later, @CampyProblems asked, quote, "Does every camp have the legend of Anson Minor?" end quote, posing his question with no less than 5 question marks. Now, I don't know if it's every camp, but Anson Minor certainly gets around. Canadian folklorist Edith Folk was the first to pick up on this fact, writing about it in her 1981 article, The Tale of Anson Minor, an Ontario camp legend. In it, she records no less than 15 different accounts that all share some common factors, not the least of which is the name Anson Minor or some close variation. In some stories, Anson is driven to madness by the sudden death of his family. In others, it is his son who is mutilated by a tractor or thresher, and it's Anson's grief that drives him insane. Sometimes the bank takes his farm, or the township, or particularly pushy owners of a summer camp. In all cases, however, the end result is the same. Anson dies in one terrible way or another, only to rise from the grave, often every year on the anniversary of his death, to take his revenge on any camper unlucky enough to encounter his ghostly green light. But Mrs. Folk discovered something even more interesting: the origin of Anson Minor. On Wednesday, April 1st, 1942, the Hamilton Spectator included this surprising headline: "Anson Minor is found dead." The article reads in part, quote, "Dunnville, April 1st. Yesterday, Anson Minor, 64, a prosperous farmer of Sherbrooke Township, was found dead in the rear seat of his car, which was parked in the home garage. It is thought that carbon monoxide gas was the cause of death. He is survived by his widow and one daughter." End quote. This event is the catalyst for the legend. The Minors were a well-known and well-established family living on the Niagara Peninsula in southern Ontario around the turn of the 20th century. Anson Kenneth Minor was born in Haldimand County on August 2, 1877, the son of Reuben and Elizabeth, and inherited a significant amount of property along the north shore of Lake Erie. He married a woman named Candace Irene Neese in 1908, and together they had 2 children. A son, Floyd, born in 1912, and a daughter, Jean, born in 1914. Tragedy struck in 1918 when 6-year-old Floyd, playing in the barn while his father was unloading hay, accidentally caught his foot in the pulley block of the hay fork rope. His ankle was crushed, and much of his leg had to be amputated. The boy survived, but sadly died less than 5 years later in 1923 when he contracted pneumonia at the age of 10. 20 years later, Anson Minor took his own life. And while we don't know for certain the farmer's motivations, we can imagine that Anson may have continued to struggle with his son's tragic injury and untimely death. With her husband dead and daughter married, Candace Minor was forced to sell the farm, 160 acres in total, which included, quote, a sandy beach, 2 natural gas wells, 2 houses, a summer cottage, good barns, spring water, and well-tilled soil, end quote. It was months before a buyer finally came along. The Labor Zionist movement, headquartered in Toronto, purchased the property, and in the spring of 1944, the Anson Minor Farm, as it was known, was transformed into Camp Kfutza, a summer camp focused on celebrating Jewish history and culture. Now, any kid who lived in the area would have known at least some of the story or rumors surrounding Anson Minor's tragic suicide. Even if they didn't, they would have learned pretty quickly, either from the locals they encountered while on their way to the camp, or from their fellow campers on their first night. The ramshackle garage where Anson's body was found still stood on the property, along with an outhouse, an enormous barn, a well, and 2 houses, one made of wood, the other of brick. Years later, Mikkel Mitch Herzog, a retired professor and one of Camp Kfutza's earliest counselors, recalled his first night spent on the property. After hitchhiking and busing the 90 miles from Toronto, 17-year-old Mitch and his friends, tasked with making all of the pre-camp preparations, decided to bed down for the night in one of the abandoned houses. In the book Remembering Camp Kfutza by Toby Pidgey Gordon, he wrote, quote, "What do you do when it gets dark?" Dark, what an understatement. The darkness was vast and unbroken. Anyway, you turn on the lights, right? Lights. Are you kidding? There was an old farmhouse without electricity. Gas jets stuck out of the walls. Imagine our first night in this godforsaken place, in a room in an old farmhouse eerily lit by a gas mantle, a sickly yellowish light with a greenish haze around it. No telephone, no vehicle, 7 miles from civilization. I was the youngest of the crew. These were my older friends, but I don't think they were any more at ease than I was, end quote. What would become the legend of Anson Minor began there, in that farmhouse, by a group of sleep-deprived teens doing their best to keep it together as a violent thunderstorm raged outside. In the light of an eerie gas mantle, they blended fantasy with fact and rumor to create a story that could distract them from their very real fears. No one person started the legend, of course. That's not how these things work. Instead, the entire camp became its author. Over time, every unexplained noise, every sudden shadow, every time the hair stood up on the back of a camper's neck, Anson Minor was to blame. The hazy details of the Minor family's legacy were swept up and rearranged into the story. It was not his son, but Anson himself who injured his leg. The date of his death was moved from March 31st to August 1st to better align with peak summer camp storytelling. The green light on the docks of Port Maitland, Ontario, roughly a kilometer west from the camp, became Anson Minor's swinging lantern. And when two campers snuck into the barn after nightfall to put on a show with ghostly howls and sporadic flashes of light, the barn became the obvious place for a grisly death and a restless ghost. Like most beloved campfire tales, the legend served two key purposes. The first, of course, was to entertain and to scare the living daylights out of young, impressionable campers. The second was to serve as a natural deterrent for any kid who might consider wandering the camp alone after dark. Sure, you could educate them about the dangers of wild animals, night swimming, and the potential of getting lost in the surrounding wilderness, but a time-honored tradition about a homicidal ghost would likely prove far more effective at keeping the kids safe and sound. Camp Kfutza was closed in 1965, and the property eventually became part of Rock Point Provincial Park. But the story didn't die with the camp. Over the course of its 20-year history, campers and counselors alike grew up and moved on, carrying the story with them to other Jewish camps throughout Ontario and beyond, ensuring that entirely new generations of campers will get to hear the legend in places like Camp Northland in Haliburton, Ontario, Camp Tamaqua in Huntsville, Ontario, and Camp Kadima in Barse Corner, Nova Scotia. The Legend of Anson Minor is fascinating because it's a true spine-tingling campfire tale and urban legend with most of its provenance still intact. We can trace its origins back through the decades to one specific camp in Ontario, and from there, in line with the legend's own claims, to the family who owned the land and their own tragic story. Taken at face value, it's a great bit of spooky campfire fun. But when we look a little closer, it allows us a glimpse at how summer camp folklore is born, how it can change and develop over time, and how it can serve simultaneously as escapist entertainment and as an inclusive tradition to welcome newcomers into an exclusive society, maintaining a sense of community and continuity long after the original storytellers are gone. A lot of Canadian kids have grown up over the years with the tale of Anson Minor still lodged somewhere in their long-term memory, rising to the surface every few years around the 1st of August to remind them of all that fun and all those frights they had when they were kids. The legend says that Anson Minor still haunts the wilds of Ontario. And, in a way, that's right. As long as the story continues to be shared, kids will continue to see his shadow and hear his phantom footsteps outside their tents and cabins. And they'll continue to see his green lantern loping across the horizon, burning as brightly as the memories of a dozen generations who came before. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening, and for joining me in becoming part of a Canadian folk tradition. Now that you know the story, share it, and remember to stay safe and alert when you're out in the wilderness. And if you see a green light swinging far off in the darkness, it might just be best to stay inside. Fireside Canada is written and recorded by me, David Williams, with sound design by Matt Kesselman. Stephanie Phillips is our showrunner. Mary Jubrin is our digital editor. Diana Kay is our business manager. Jordan Heath-Rawlings is our executive producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving this podcast a positive review. If you want to help even further, you can provide story ideas and more through my website. Every little bit helps to keep the fire burning and the library of legends growing. Learn more at firesidecanada.ca.
Hello, hello. I'm Malik.
I'm Jamie.
And this is World Gone Wrong, where we discuss the unprecedented times we're living through.
Can your manager still schedule you for night shifts after that werewolf bit you?
My ex-boyfriend was replaced by an alien body snatcher, but I think I like him better now.
Who is this dude showing up in everyone's old pictures?
My friend says the sewer alligators are reading maps now.
When did the kudzu start making that humming sound?
We are just your normal millennial roommates processing our feelings about a chaotic world in front of some microphones.
World Gone Wrong, a new fiction podcast from Audacious Machine Creative, creators of Unwell, a Midwestern Gothic mystery. Learn more at audaciousmachinecreative.com.
Find World Gone Wrong in all the regular places you find podcasts.
I love you so much. I mean, you could up the energy a little
You
bit.
could up the energy.
I actually don't take notes.
That was good.
I'm just kidding. You sounded great.
So did you.